What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Daily Dish. Been a minute, but we'll get into some Big 12 action here. Men's basketball, we got me, your host, Christian Royston. I got Logan Shanks next to me. And then on the women's side, I'll have them introduce themselves.
How's it going, guys? Long time no see. It's Pavel Markovic again from the women's basketball beat.
And Brett Twellmeyer, also women's basketball reporter.
Sweet. So we'll just move right into men's basketball. We had a couple road games, some less than ideal loss, and then kind of a rocky win there against TCU. Although they did get the win, it wasn't great, but we can start with BYU.
Yeah, first of all, from BYU, they just didn't really look like themselves. It was one of those games where we were talking about afterwards that, the big thing that they gave up was three-pointers. You give up 13 three-pointers. I think one guy, Spencer Johnson, goes off for like 30 points. Defensively, it was just one of those games where Iowa State, they've always lived this season off of their forcing turnovers to create their offense. They obviously couldn't do that. And then offensively, they couldn't get their shots going. They haven't really been a great three-point shooting team this season. So then you already take that aspect away. They made it a game for the better part of the first half, but then in that second half, they just started to run away with it. The momentum was fully in BYU's favor.
Yeah, and you talk about those threes, and especially open threes. We've seen Iowa State give up those open shots time and again, but against a team like BYU that shoots the ball really well, you really don't want to give up those threes. And I think we saw maybe almost like a lack of confidence from Iowa State beyond the arc, because BYU made almost as many shots from three as Iowa State took.
Yeah, and BYU did a great job of taking away the paint that Iowa State has, that's been the better part of their offense, because really then that forced Iowa State and guys like Curtis Jones, Keyshawn Gilbert, mainly the guards, and even Milan, kind of take some shots where they don't really, kind of like you said, they didn't really feel confident in them. You're seeing Curtis Jones putting up floaters when you're down like 18 points. And that's because there's 3-point shots taken away. Like I said, Iowa State's they haven't been a great 3-point shooting team this season. So really BYU just did a great job of taking away every scoring level and making it hard for, Iowa State to come back. And also Iowa State got into foul trouble with a lot of guys. So that put BYU at the line and just made it easy for them to hold on to the lead that they created probably like 5 minutes into that second half.
Mm-hmm. It seemed like it was just BYU was getting opportunities and Iowa State was losing their opportunities. Going back to even the 3-point shooting, I talked to Milan during media availability, and he just said he wants to see the team shoot the ball more, which I feel like we haven't really heard much from people, but it did seem like with the paint being taken away, you kind of want to, even if the shots aren't falling, you kind of just want to put up shots, and it just kind of seemed like Iowa State wasn't the aggressor, which I think the games that they've come out on top, they've been the aggressor.
Right. And for Milan to say that, it doesn't just talk about him as, he's been their main 3-point shooter outside of guys like Curtis Jones. So I think that shows that he has confidence that not only he can make shots, but this whole team can. And we've seen that. We've seen guys like Curtis Jones have good 3-point shooting games. Keyshawn can knock down threes every once in a while. And even though Taman, who we'll get to his injury later, he is a guy that should be shooting more threes when he's out there on the court, because he's done a great job at that. So I think it's all about just creating 3-point shots. But I think the problem there also is that I think TJ doesn't really, his first 3 years here, you've seen he doesn't script threes. They're more just in transition or, when they go into the paint and they just kick it out, late shot clock, they need a three. They have 3-point shooters, but they don't have 3-point plays lined up for those shooters to get those shots up.
And I think that's something that maybe he needs to look at going forward, because they have people that can shoot threes now. It's not like a season ago where you had kind of limited options on who you were going to go to, but they have Milan who can pretty much shoot threes at will. You have Taman, who's gotten really good at hitting his threes. Keyshawn can put up shots. Kurt has been he's been an experienced shooter as well. So they have a lot of guys that can put up shots, but they're just not able to script them the plays, like you said. And I think if they want to succeed in the Big 12, you can't just rely on paint points, because as we saw against BYU, that's not always going to be an option. Right. And, when you're expecting points in the paint and they don't come, you kind of have to be creative. And I think that's where the 3 is going to be handy.
Mm-hmm. And I think really BYU wasn't like a wake-up call per se. I mean, it's a road game in the Big 12. You're not supposed to win games on the road, and just adding the factor of a Big 12, which BYU coming into this conference, unlike in football, they actually have done really well for basketball, beating teams like Iowa State, who, they've obviously been in the conference for a while, been one of the powerhouses for the last probably the last 10 years. And so I think it wasn't much of a wake-up call, but then you look at the TCU game, they didn't even really fix the three-point shooting. They just got back to what they were good at, and I think they just tweaked some things in there that they saw in the BYU game to get their offense going, and that TCU win was without Tamin Lipsey.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about no Tamin Lipsey, although it didn't really affect the outcome of the BYU game since it really felt over by the time Tamin got hurt. I think there were a couple things. You talk about foul trouble. I mean, Hassan Ward got ejected from that game. They kind of got sloppy, and I think, you have a guy like Tamin who's obviously dealt with injuries before, and he's just always putting his body on the line. You were kind of expecting him to be injured at some point, and I think it caught up to him in that end of the BYU game, and we kind of saw how the team reacted to that and played without him.
Right. And it's going to be different to deal with this because we knew that Hassan, it was a foot thing. He's going to be out until before non-conference play, and he actually came back for that. But now, again, Iowa State's at a spot where they're losing another starter. And I think with Tamin, it's more, they've said he's day-to-day, but I think really with the shoulder injury, that could, you don't want to re-aggravate that. Probably said that wrong again, but anyway. But for Tamin to be, we don't know if he's even going to be ready for Kansas State. So, and you definitely don't want to, have him be out for multiple weeks, because not to say that, Iowa State still can't do something if he's out for the rest of the season, but it's going to be a lot harder, and the games are not going to come as easy as it did against TCU.
Yeah, we can get more into the TCU game in a bit after we throw it to the women side, but finishing up with the Tamin talk, shoulder, you really don't want to re-aggravate the shoulder. Obviously, that's one that you kind of need to play if you're a point guard. But the team also has shown that, they're used to practicing without him occasionally. Mm-hmm. They played well without him. I think it's something that if they let him rest for like a week or two, it should be back to normal. We're hoping it's not a lingering thing, but I feel like the team can survive without Tamin for a little bit, and I guess we're just kind of hoping that it's not anything too bad. Haven't heard much on it.
And I think they're really fortunate. One, it's good to hear that he's day-to-day, because I feel like Otzelberger would just be honest, like if he was out for the season, he would be out. So I would expect that when he does come back, he's wearing like a sling or has it wrapped up pretty well. And they're also very fortunate that they get to play their next 2 games at home. Now, while it's against good teams in Kansas State and Kansas, we've seen how Iowa State plays at Hilton. And like you said, I think even more so, Iowa State can be all right without Tamin, but I think just being back at home in Hilton with the crowd, that's going to help them out way more, because they won against Kansas last year. Now, I think Kansas is probably a better team this year than they were last year, but I think that's the same for Iowa State as well.
Yeah, and you go back to the team can survive without Tamin. We saw it, we've seen it. I think it just comes down to, can they keep the momentum going so when he does get back on the court, they can kind of just keep building on that momentum. We saw, Fish was he had a shoulder thing and he had to get surgery. Although Tamin's is a shoulder sprain, so you're hoping that he doesn't need surgery for that. And I think if he did, we would have either found out around the TCU game or either this week. So we'll probably have more next week when it comes out, but day to day, you're just kind of hoping for the best. And, after we'll probably be done with the BYU talk. Obviously a loss that's showed a lot, but not too much that we didn't already know. The women's side, they only had 1 game this week because of an unexpected forfeit from TCU. So I guess what did we see out of the Texas Tech game?
Oh, before the Texas Tech game, obviously we didn't talk about it with you guys last time we had this podcast, but upsetting West Virginia and number 4 Baylor at home was huge. And it just, you think like the energy we brought into the Texas Tech game, but obviously it didn't.
Yeah, the win over West Virginia was big too because, trailing by 19 points in the third quarter and something changes and, you go on a huge run and end up winning the game by 10 points. And Bill Fenley was saying after that game he did not remember a game when they had to come back by that many points.
And even in the Baylor game too, like I know they were slow start against them too, and obviously they started to pick it up. And what even Coach Fenley talked about was the crowd. Like Hilton Magic, despite all the cold temperatures and the snow and all this stuff to make it hard to get to Hilton, Hilton still showed up even when they were expecting not to, and he just really accredited them.
And then that scene of Bill, pumping his fist, thanking the fans for showing up and then sprinting off the court, just electric, and shows the kind of person that he is and how much, coaching this program means to him.
Yes, and of course now we moved forward to the Texas Tech game, but before even the Texas Tech game, the women's team found out that TCU actually forfeited their next 2 matches, which were against Kansas State that Wednesday, and then they were supposed to travel to Ames on Saturday, and due to not having enough players due to injuries, which is a shock to everyone. Usually you don't see this happen from teams.
Yeah, at first I thought it was, sickness, could have been COVID or something, and then you see that, they're starting point guards out for the year with an ACL injury, and then they kept on stacking up each other. And I've never seen anything like this happen before, and it really, I think, is going to... There's 2 things that can happen for Iowa State specifically because of not playing that game. It's either A, they're going to bounce back from this. They lost to Texas Tech. They didn't play this game, so they have some time to prepare for the next one. Or you're going to be in an even bigger slump now because you lost, you didn't get to have this opportunity, and then, I don't know, we'll just see what happens, I guess.
I like to use this phrase called rest or rust. Like you get to rest and really just like prepare for their next game, which is against KU this Wednesday, or that's rust where they're not used to playing. It's been a week, like it's out of the ordinary. But yeah, I mean, obviously with this news, like you think they gained the conference when the overall record wasn't impacted due to NCAA rules. And I mean, maybe this played a factor in their Texas Tech. Maybe they're like high hopes, like kind of ahead of themselves.
Yeah, the Tech game really did not go the Cyclones' way at all, just trailing pretty much the entire game. But I think the main takeaway for Iowa State specifically was this was Emily Ryan's best game by far that she had played in since coming back from her injury. She played her most minutes at 31. She entered the game 2 minutes into the game. So it feels like she's inching closer to possibly getting back into a starting role. I mean, she started the game off too with Iowa State's first 4 points, lead scoring with 18. So it's nice to see that she is starting to really contribute a lot more to this team.
And I really do think, Brett, that Emily will definitely be in the starting lineup very soon. Like, there's no way you can't keep her out of that. I mean, I like her as a 6th man too, like off the bench, just right off the bench. But you got to put her in the starting lineup. Like, if you add her to that starting lineup along with players like Addie Brown and Audie Crooks, like you can just set the tone early, and that's what you can get ahead of these good teams.
Yeah, and that's the problem that Iowa State has had too, is their first half has not been nearly as good as their second half in a lot of games this year. So I think that heading into these upcoming games, possibly, like you said, put Emily Ryan in the starting lineup, set the tone early, and just maintain that and hang on and hope that your second half effort stays how it's been this year.
And I also want to talk about, even though Iowa State did fall to Texas Tech, he still had 4 double-digit scores, obviously led by Emily Ryan. But I know those 4 players really contributed, but there's also like the rest of the group like didn't even get over 4 points, and that's not a good sign to see. Yeah,
it was really a yin and yang type of performance. You had your contributors, and then you had your ones that didn't have the best of games per se.
And also some of Texas Tech players too, like got off to a hot start, like this one. What was her name? Riley McKinney, I think how you pronounce it. She got off to a hot start, which really helped Texas Tech too.
Yep. Yeah, and I think too that the big issue for Iowa State was Addie Brown in this one. She really wasn't as much of a force as we've seen her be. Her only 2 points came off of some free throws really late in the game, so she wasn't able to score the basketball. She did get some rebounds and everything, but she just wasn't that present on offense, and then she ended up fouling out of the game too, so that was a bit unfortunate.
Yeah, I'd say this is a bit of a down game, obviously, for Addie Brown. I mean, players usually have like not good games like every once in a while. And I also wanted to talk about Naidu. Like, ever since Big 12 play started, like she's more known for her defensive presence, but like her scoring wise, she hasn't reached double digits yet. This during the Big 12 season, that's really been a big problem.
Yeah, I thought that she really would have, kept her scoring ability and her ability all around to, that we saw in the non-conference season, that she really looked like she was going to be a leader. But I'm wondering if maybe it's because we're seeing Emily Ryan come back that maybe there's something going on in there that she's not performing as well. So we'll have to see if she can get a bounce back game somewhere this week.
So although the women obviously didn't play against TCU looking for players on social media, I saw the men's side did play against TCU, and they also picked up a win, although they actually had to grind that one out.
Yeah. I mean, it got really close towards the end, but honestly, Iowa State opened up and they played how they've been able to play at home, which was really surprising. That's the first kind of road game in the Big 12 where they've actually looked really good and kind of looked very similar to, again, how they have been playing at home. And a large part of that is the turnovers that they were able to force, and oh my goodness, did they force a lot.
Yeah, 27 turnovers is crazy. I mean, they were talking about it the entire time on the broadcast. I mean, they had 18 at half. It was the most that, and obviously it's a disclaimer, it was against a TCU team that was averaging like 12 and a half turnovers a game, which was like 9th in the Big 12. Like, it was a team that pretty much what they did against Oklahoma State, who also another team that didn't turn the ball over that much. They just forced a ton of turnovers.
Right.
And that 27 number was, I think, the most by Iowa State's in the Big 12 in history. And it was the most that TCU's turned it over since, gosh, I want to say either 1991 or 1993.
And the turnovers that they were getting, it was like, you had Curtis Jones getting steals, like jump in passes and whatnot. But a lot of it was just TCU kind of fumbling the ball around in the paint, and Iowa State was just there. And they weren't. And then after that, they're getting into scoring in transition, having the momentum, with, pick and roll. And, we talked about they didn't have Taman for this one. And then you were telling me before we were starting to record the podcast that Curtis Jones like transformed into Taman Lipsey. He had 7 steals. He finished with 7 steals. And he had 2 threes from outside, but really, he was really good at putting up shots that he was missing in the BYU game. He was hitting against TCU.
Mm-hmm. And you talk about Curtis Jones. I mean, I don't know if anybody had Curtis Jones nearly breaking the steal record on their bingo card, but that was kind of crazy. I mean, 7 steals. If it weren't for Taman's 8 earlier in the year, that would have been tied for the record. And, I mean, can you ask for a better performance on your first start as a Cyclone?
Right.
I mean, not only it really was his defensive pressure, but he was also moving the ball around. He had a good amount of assists. He had some rebounds. He was pretty much doing what Lipsey usually does, and he was just facilitating the floor, filling out the stat sheet, and just like playing efficient ball.
Right. And then other guys that just what they were doing in the BYU game wasn't working, but then it did against TCU was Keyshawn Gilbert, again, getting back to his going in the paint, putting his head down, moving the ball in, and just putting shots up. So, I mean, that was great to see him kind of get back to that. But going back to Curtis, there has been times this season where, I thought we got him just for 3-point shooting. And when he doesn't really do that well, I wonder, okay, well, why does he have a significant role in this lineup? But it just really showed against TCU that his defense, working with TJ, is really what has like gotten him minutes and, has gotten him to start over, Jackson, who could have been in there. He got some minutes, but to see him filling for that starting point guard role, while he didn't really get the assist that Taman Lipsey gets, I think that's where Keyshawn also picked up the slack there. So overall, I think Iowa State responded well after getting punched in the mouth by BYU and then having to go on another road game to TCU. Now, I mean, they were up by 20 at one point or close to it. Now TCU made it a really close game towards the end. And I think that was really just Iowa State kind of letting their foot off the gas for the last 5 minutes of the game.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we saw the same thing against Texas A&M. Mm-hmm. Iowa State has a big lead at half, and then they kind of fall asleep in the second half at times. I mean, they let up. There was 3 separate points in the second half where TCU was on a big run. And I think you give up those runs and don't answer back with runs of your own, you're kind of allowing them to cut into the lead. And I mean, 20 minutes is a long time. And it almost felt like they came into that with an 18-point lead. They were like, well, we can just run the clock out for 20 minutes. And that was almost not the case.
Right. And then, I mean, you have guys like Hassan Ward, again, getting into foul trouble. So that kind of hurts them a little bit. That's something we have kind of talked about, is that, and then also Trey King has 4 fouls at one point. So when you have your 2 big men that play significant minutes in the lineup, each doing different things. Obviously Trey King's more of a rebound type of guy, putting up shots as well in the paint, and then Hassan playing above the rim. When you kind of take those pieces out and you're shorthanded with Lipsy, I think that kind of got caught there in that last 5 to 6 minutes. But I mean, they pulled it out, and then the last 2 minutes, they made some shots and had some clutch free throws at the end by Curtis Jones. So that helped them get the win. But the 73-72 final score does not show, how good Iowa State really did play in that game for the better half of probably 32 minutes of that game.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously a 1-point win. They hit a last-second 3, so it's kind of take that with a grain of salt. Mm-hmm. But TCU was within 4 for, I want to say, 4 minutes there, or at least 2.5 minutes. They were within 4. And I think Iowa State, they got complacent, they got sloppy, and they let them come back within 4. But then those last 2 minutes, they did what they needed to do to shut them down. They weren't letting up shots from TCU. I mean, they let up a couple, but then they would answer back with shots of their own. And then when they were getting fouled, they were making the most of their trips at the line. And I think that's what they need to do going forward.
And we see this from TJ a lot. We actually saw it again this season, not just with Texas A&M, but against Houston. Iowa State had a huge lead, and then Houston comes back to make it a close game. But I think what TJ does really well coaching-wise is he gets his guys locked back in those last couple minutes. Obviously, the Houston game is different because Milan hits that crazy shot, but they found a different way to win where, they let up some runs throughout the second half. I think definitely I would say that TCU won the second half, but it was enough. Iowa State did enough in the first half and then the last 2 minutes of the second half to win the game. And you get that, bad stink, or I don't know what words I'm trying to find here, but they get the taste of the BYU loss out of their mouth. And now that they can focus, and like I said earlier in this podcast, they're very fortunate that they get these next 2 games at home, even though it is against, some of the better teams in the Big 12.
Mm-hmm. And then, I mean, winning on the road, we've talked about it being tough in the Big 12, obviously, but TCU is a team that they beat a top 10 Oklahoma at home. They beat Houston at home. Mm-hmm. Iowa State picked up that win at TCU, which, right. I mean, it's a 1-point win. Obviously, they almost let up a comeback, but still getting the win shows that even in tough environments, they still have, they can still win. It's not just, I mean, that to me showed me that this wasn't a team that can just play at Hilton, right, which is a good sign for when tournament play comes up.
And they needed that because they were starting to look like a team that couldn't just win at Hilton. Obviously, we're going to have to see that after these next 2 games. Then they're going to go back on the road. But, I mean, Iowa State after this next week can look like one of the most solid teams in the Big 12 if they can win these next 2 games, even if I would say they split them, because you probably drop the next game you probably drop the game against Kansas, even though it's at home. But, I mean, we're just going to have to see because, again, we don't know. Lipsy could be back. And I think, before the BYU loss, Iowa State was looking really solid, probably the best they had ever looked this season.
Mm-hmm. And, I mean, you look at, obviously, Lipsy being out could be a factor in the Hilton games, but, I want to shout out my guy at 24/7, Alec, for putting me on this, but the Ewing effect, we might see that play out where, I mean, they lost Lipsy and then they played really well. Obviously Patrick Ewing, when he was injured in those finals when he was on the Knicks, I want to say, they ended up winning that series and actually doing really well. So maybe the Ewing effect is in play and Iowa State's just going to play really well for a couple weeks until obviously either Lipsy gets back or diminishing returns happen. But I mean, with no Lipsy, we saw them come out against TCU and look really good for 30 minutes or so.
Right. And if they can be significantly above 500 with Lipsy out, I'd be very surprised. And I think that should be encouraging for, if they do that. But who knows? Maybe Taman's back in this next game against Kansas State. We're just going to have to see. But overall, just a nice bounce back win for a team that, like I said, was looking really solid until they have kind of just like an uncharacteristic, just overall bad game against BYU to come back and then beat TCU on the road, puts them one spot up in the rankings, which we just found out today. They're now at 23. So just overall, they are going into the Kansas State game, although down one of their, probably their best player. They still are, on the upside on a roller coaster, I would say.
Yeah, and we can talk about the players that need to step up in his shoes if he doesn't come back right away. But I think first we'll throw it to the women's side and see what players on their team that we should keep an eye on for a lot of they have some pretty solid games coming up.
I think, opposite of the men's side, they're on the road for these next 2 games at Kansas and at West Virginia, both teams who they lost to, or they beat in Ames. They beat in Ames. So I really think, obviously we talked about earlier, Emily Ryan, she's been a player to watch, obviously the leader in the Texas Tech game, but even when she's not scoring points in her limited minutes, she's really being out there being a effective leader. She's really vocal, like we've heard from the players and Coach Fenn. I think she's one of the biggest players to watch for sure.
Yeah, I'm going to cheat here a little bit because I've got 2 that I want to talk about. So first off, I'm going to go with Hannah Bellinger because when she is shooting the ball effectively, I think that the team, cohesively, offensively, defensively, they just play better. And when you look at the stats too, in Big 12 play, the 6 games, she's shooting 50% from 3, which is unreal. So I think if she can keep that up, then Iowa State's going to be in a really good position. And the other player I want to talk about too is Audie Crooks because she won Big 12 Player of the Week, not just Freshman of the Week, Player of the Week in a conference that's full of experienced, really good players, and that was due to the effort from the West Virginia game and the Baylor game. So I think that her effort is going to be needed again. I think that obviously Emily Ryan's effort is going to be needed. They're all going to need to play as a cohesive unit to be able to sweep not only Kansas but West Virginia as well.
Sorry, I just found out that Hannah Bellinger hit 6 threes against Kansas.
That's crazy.
When you said that she was hitting over 50% of her shots in Big 12 play, I was surprised by that. That's crazy.
That is a wild stat.
In Lawrence too. Okay, well,
yeah.
Sorry, I was not familiar with your game, Hannah Bellinger.
I know. Really threw me off.
Had to stat check that real quick.
I know. Yeah, on the men's side, we also kind of have a pair of people that really, they've played well in the past, and we kind of need them to play well going forward. I'll start with, Kurt Jones is the guy that is going to have to step up. He did step up against TCU, but if Lipsy is out for an extended period of time, or at least the next week, Curtis has to kind of play the way that he played against TCU. He has to be kind of that menace on defense, and he has to be able to hit the shots and play with confidence.
Yeah, and we know that he has that confidence. Every time we talk to him, he seems confident in himself, but also with TJ, he has, I think, ever since the start of Big 12 play, kind of gained the confidence, especially defensively, from his coach. And what TJ praised a lot was that even though Taman's down, you still have guys like Keyshawn, Jackson, and Kurt that are all comfortable with the ball in their hands as point guards. And I think we saw that even with the small time that Jackson got to play. And Keyshawn's obviously, he's always going to be a guy that he'll take his shot, he'll drive into the lane. But kind of like you said, Kurt just needs to consistently play kind of like Taman, but also hit his shots and do what he can do, which, like we said, he has the confidence to do. For me, a guy that I really want to see who has stepped up a little bit, and especially in that TCU game with the kind of rotational switches, was Demarion Watson. Big play towards the end. A swat from a corner 3 was crazy. And that's something that I felt like we have kind of been waiting for. This is a 6'7" guard. So he has showed that he can defend pretty much anyone on the court, and scoring wise too, he's played really well. He had a couple shots above the rim as well, and just kind of, again, working into the paint. He's not really going to be a guy that takes 3-pointers, probably not even mid-range shots, but what he can kind of provide is the make up for the length as a guard. But then also, he's very pesky in the paint as well, breaking up passes and getting loose balls. So if he can continue to do that with Taman's absence, I think that just offers a very versatile defensive guard that I've always praised him for. And the more minutes he gets, he said that, when his time comes, he's going to be ready for it. And I think he really was against TCU. And I think he knows that with the spot that he is in right now, a guy coming off the bench that can really turn some heads these next couple games.
Watson was a guy that when we talked to TJ following Lipsy's injury, he was a guy in that list with Kurt and Keyshawn and Jackson that were guys that can take that role. And I mean, yeah, he's a really tall guard, but he has pretty good length too, which I mean you got a guy like Hassan Ward who has crazy length. You got a guy like Taman who's out, who kind of plays like he's like 6'7", yeah. And I mean now you have Kurt who's kind of mirroring Taman in a way that he's able to disrupt passing lanes and poke balls out. And I think obviously Watson hasn't filled out the stat sheet, but I think what he does on defense more than makes up for that. I mean, what we've seen from the start of Big 12 play is that he doesn't need to score. He can just be there, be wherever he needs to be on defense. And if he can score, he will.
Right. And I think he's just a guy that, like anyone else, just wants to make plays. And I feel like having that chip on your shoulder, coming off the bench, just not only playing your role, but also playing your kind of game. And I think he does a great job using his size and length. And I mean, you just really saw it on that block with like whatever it was, 2 minutes left in the corner. I mean, just right place, right time.
Slapped it into like the 6th row. Like,
yeah, it was crazy.
Yeah, and not only that, I mean, he can shoot threes. Like he has a stroke. We've seen it last year, and I mean, you got a guy like Trey King who can shoot threes. I mean, De'Aaron Watson should be able to hit a couple, right? So I mean, it's one of those things where his offense will come along as he gets more minutes on the court. Right. But right now, I think he's just making the most of his minutes on defense, and he's really fitting in well where, I mean, a lot of bench players might come in and you see like a little bit of a hiccup right away, kind of what we see like maybe occasionally when like Omaha is in, but Watson comes in and it's almost like he played the whole game already.
And it's almost like Watson's kind of on the same trajectory that Curtis was on, because Kurt, especially in Big 12 play, and kind of towards the end of non-conference play, his offense wasn't really what stood out. It was his defense. So I feel like that's kind of what the path that De'Marian's on right now. Like you say, he's not really focused on being the guy putting up 15 points a game. He's fine with just getting 4-6 points, but playing really solid defense, getting a couple rebounds, forcing turnovers, which I think TJ sees, and that's why he's getting more minutes.
Mm-hmm. I mean, you talk about Kurt. He's one of those guys that, like, yeah, he doesn't score 17 points a game like he did against TCU, but he's a guy that can hit shots. I mean, he's one of those momentum-based three-point shooters where if he sees one fall down early, he's probably hitting 4 more in that game. But I mean, what he's talked about is or I guess TJ has even talked about it. He's one of those guys that needs to get that momentum early, because what he's done recently is maybe miss a couple or try to hit a three that might be a little bit too out of his range. And when those miss, it's kind of hard to get back into it. But I mean, Kurt can hit those threes, and he has been a proven sharpshooter. And I think what we saw against TCU is that he can step up when need be. Mm-hmm. So we will, enough with the players to watch. I guess you can talk all you want about. I mean, every player kind of needs to step up going forward, but on the docket next up for the women's side, we'll have them look over the upcoming game.
So next game on Wednesday, the Iowa State team travels to Lawrence, Kansas to take on Kansas, like we mentioned earlier, and it's gonna be difficult to say for sure, because obviously Allen Fieldhouse, even men's and women's, is really tough to play at, and Kansas itself, they're 7-1 this year at home, even with their 9-9 record.
Yeah, I think the thing that screams out to me at Kansas, though, is I know projections don't really mean everything, but they're a team that was projected third in the Big 12 this year. And the fact that they're sitting there at 9-9 and they're 2-5 in the conference, and they've played a lot of these top teams and they haven't beat them, I think it just kind of shows that Kansas really isn't as good as we thought they were. And I think that was proven, too, when they came to Ames. You know, Iowa State did start off a little slow in the first quarter, but things really bounced back in that second quarter, and it felt like it was all Iowa State from there. So I think that we're going to be in for a really good show.
Yeah, I think one of the things, too, when you look at the last matchup was obviously Iowa State had 19 turnovers, like almost a team high, but it actually wasn't. But still, like, cleaning that up will be huge, obviously, at Kansas. And also wanted to mention, obviously, Kansas on a 2-game losing streak, lost both to Texas and Kansas State on the road. So, I mean, obviously they want to bounce back, and perfect way to do it at home, and especially since they lost to Ames. So I think it'll be a good matchup all around.
And then another thing to watch out for, too, is Hannah Bellinger, who did go 6 from 10 from 3-point range in the first game. So we'll have to see if she can follow that up with another big performance in this one. And then also the free throws, too. Iowa State's been struggling with free throws. They've been doing better as games have gone on. But against Kansas and Ames, Iowa State shot twice as many free throws as Kansas did. And I think that was really something that kind of allowed them to put themselves in front and stay in front. So maybe they'll need to rely a little bit more on the post game in this one. You know, the threes might not fall. They might not get to the line. So we'll just have to see how this game plays out.
Yeah, I really think also, I mean, we're going to talk about how the TCU game, the forfeit. We talked about how this preparation could be handled for this. I mean, obviously, what you mentioned, everything could be used, and it's all just a waiting game to see what happens on Wednesday.
So the men also have a Kansas gauntlet, but they don't play their Kansas team until later in the week. But first, they start with Kansas State at home.
Right. And Kansas State has looked like one of the better teams in the Big 12, regardless of not being in the top 25. They're the second team, or it's them and Texas Tech, I want to say, that's 4-1 in the Big 12. Could be wrong when I say that. But either way, I'm just looking at them before recording this podcast. They've been one of the better defensive teams in the Big 12. They have allowed the second fewest amount of points averaged against Big 12 opponents. Now, they have played, for lack of better terms, some stinker teams. They have, gotten lucky they got to play Oklahoma State. So, that, I hate to say it, it's almost chalked up to a free win at this point, but looking more what Kansas has done really well. They have been really good scorers. They're good at finding assists. I think they're actually they have the second highest margin of victory, among Big 12 teams against, conference teams. So overall, just really solid team. The one thing that they have struggled with, though, is turnovers. So if we see Iowa State get into what they did against TCU, start forcing a lot of turnovers against Kansas State, I could see, Iowa State taking care of business. But, if Kansas State's able to get into their offense, and much like in the BYU game, Iowa State can't really answer for that, then, could be swinging the other way for them.
Mm-hmm. And Kansas State is obviously coming off a hot week. They took down Baylor, and although it was kind of a close win against Oklahoma State, they still beat Oklahoma State. The one thing to note, though, is that both those wins were at home, and now they have to go to Hilton, which, I mean, obviously we knew Hilton Magic was a thing to begin with, but after what happened against Houston at home, I think we're kind of sitting there like, well, Iowa State is a team that's going to defend their home turf, and this could be a very good opportunity for them to shut down a team that's hot, a team that nearly hit the rankings. Like if they were, they'd probably be ranked number 27 at this point, and just have another opportunity to get a Big 12 win.
Right. And this is like really, so yeah, Iowa State gets that upset win with Houston at home. And then after that, they have kind of a wonky game against Oklahoma State. They win, but that was when it got pushed back 2-3 hours because of the blizzard. So really, in terms of playing at home with Hilton Magic, they haven't had a normal home game since the Houston game. So, and then even this one isn't until 8:00 on a Wednesday, which I know me and you are a little mad about. I don't really get it.
Yeah.
If I'm being honest, like this, we're not playing at BYU. We don't need to start this at 8:00 Central Time, but it is what it is. I see, if Iowa State can get the turnovers going, and which results in their offense, I can see them still winning without Taman Lipsey, really, but just Kansas State has looked like one of the better teams in the Big 12. And I know, like I said, their defense has looked really good against bad teams, but I think that just builds confidence. Like I said, they started the season 4-1 in conference play. So, and then even against their one loss was against Texas Tech, which was on the road, and they only lost by 1 point. So they've proven that, they can, keep themselves in games against good teams, especially on the road. And we've always praised teams that can win on the road in the Big 12.
And although Hilton is one of probably the tougher, if not like the toughest environment to play in on the road, I think this is a team that might cause problems. I mean, besides, it almost seems like it's going to be a battle of the defenses. I mean, we've seen what Iowa State can do against teams that don't turn the ball over much. So we'll kind of see what we're in for when they face a team that does. But, I mean, you're going up against a defense that's probably top 3 currently in the Big 12. And Iowa State in itself is probably in that conversation as well. So this could be kind of a similar game to the Houston game where it's going to be whoever can get the very limited shots that they can.
Right. And you talk about getting shots. Another thing I wanted to talk about was that Kansas State, just overall in the Big 12, 3-point shooting is not great, like percentage-wise. The top team among conference teams, so now that Big 12 play has started, the best 3-point shooting team percentage-wise is Texas Tech, and they're averaging 40%.
Which is still good.
It's good, but then you move down to Kansas State, so they're the 4th best 3-point shooting team against Big 12 teams, but they're shooting 36%. And then, they're actually the best defensive 3-point team, and they have held their opponents to 25% from outside the arc. But I don't really think that's going to be a problem for Iowa State because it's like, okay, you take the 3-point shot away, that's fine. As long as they can get their paint game going, I think they come out of here with a win. And, maybe they do get a couple shots. I see this being a game where Iowa State probably only makes like 4 or 5 threes, maybe like a couple in the first half. But if they can live off their turnovers and, get shots in transition and just feed the paint with guys like Rob Jones, Trey King, everyone, I could see them probably winning this game. But also I do want to say too that in terms of block shots, Kansas State is 3rd in the Big 12, averaging 5 blocks a game too. So that could also pose a threat for Iowa State, who, again, like we've said, has really focused on getting shots out inside.
Yeah, and I mean, Iowa State's probably going to win this game if they're going to win it. You talked about the 3-point defense that Kansas State brings, and I mean, it doesn't seem like it's going to be that big of a deal, for Iowa State, a team that currently hasn't been shooting the ball too well from 3. But, yeah, I mean, I don't know if block shots will be a big factor or not. I mean, Iowa State has been a team that kind of just bullies other teams in the paint. We've seen Hassan Ward almost be resurrected as just prime Shaq at this point.
He looks better than you said. He looks better now than he did before he got hurt.
And I think, what TJ said, I mean, the big reason is he's playing with intent. Like, he wants to compete. He wants to be there. Where in the past, he's almost taken a back seat. But now you have guys that can throw it down in the paint, make shots that aren't easy to block. And I mean, Iowa State has won games primarily in the paint, so going up against Kansas State as opposed to like a lot of teams that maybe are able to defend the paint better or live off fast breaks, which Iowa State tends to struggle with, this could be a matchup that does favor Iowa State.
I agree. So, I mean, probably a win for Iowa State against Kansas State, but against Kansas, I think kind of a different story. I know earlier in this podcast I said that Kansas is a better team than they were last year, but I also think Iowa State is. But I think Kansas, they have a kind of a sour taste in their mouth as well. They've had kind of some bad losses, so they're ready just as much as Iowa State is to get wins on the road.
And we'll talk more obviously about Kansas after the Kansas State game, but I mean, going into this Kansas Kansas State gauntlet. I mean, this is really the tester of the year, pretty much, to see if Iowa State really is a team that can defend at home. Because in the Big 12, you almost want to chalk home matchups as wins, just because it's so hard to win on the road. So if they can come out and prove that they're a great home team against Kansas State and Kansas with wins, then I think that puts them in a really good spot going forward.
Yeah, most likely for me, they probably split these next 2 games, but if they can win both of them, I mean, like I said earlier in the podcast, they're going to look like one of the better teams in the Big 12. I know it's wins at home, like you said. You want to chalk those up to W's, but I mean, it's all about just defending home court. And if they can get these 2 more wins, come out of this week at 5-2 in the Big 12, I think they could probably be number 1 by the end of the week record-wise. But I mean, we're just going to have to see. Should be a pretty exciting week. Some exciting games coming up for them.
Yeah. So, I mean, you said it best. We're just going to have to wait and see. So, I think that's all we got for you guys today. We'll be back later in the week when we talk about the Kansas State game, preview the upcoming week of action. So, good talking to you guys. Join us in the Daily Dish again for more basketball content. Thanks for watching.